Today, it's a peaceful scene. But not so long ago, it was where the Soviet Union paraded its military might. At the height of the Cold War, Stalin, Khrushchev and Brezhnev all denounced the imperialist USA and boasted of the superiority of the Soviet military and its weapons. But with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the inner workings of the military's industrial system were revealed, and their once secret military programs came to light. Behind the fearsome facade lay the reality. A Soviet military that was ready to sacrifice lives, and in its rush to surpass the West, a military that failed to capitalize on weapons programs of great promise. On a cold December day, mourners file past a solemn monument at a cemetery near St. Petersburg. They have come to remember those lost in an almost forgotten Cold War tragedy, the sinking of submarine M256.
We were only together 3.5 years, and we rarely saw each other. He was always at sea.
In September 1957, 35 men died when fire and toxic gas poured into their submarine in violent seas.
I wanted my children to know about grandfather.
Relatives and friends still feel the loss. But comrades and fellow survivors recall with pride their service to the Soviet cause at the height of the Cold War.
We had an extraordinary sense of responsibility and were proud to serve in such an unusual submarine.
M256 was a Quebec-class submarine, the NATO designation for a diesel sub of revolutionary design and menacing capabilities with no real counterpart in the West. Initiated under Stalin and built in the 50s, it was a top-secret project. If this revolutionary technology could be developed and built to its full potential, Stalin's Navy would have a powerful submarine that could stay submerged for record periods of time and travel at vastly improved speeds. But the potential technological advance exacted a high price: the lives of the crews who manned it. The Quebecs were sea-borne powder kegs, introduced before they were safe, and the submariners nicknamed them matchsticks. Before the advent of the Quebecs, and later nuclear submarines, diesel subs relied on batteries to run underwater. Their diesel engines required oxygen and worked only on the surface. But batteries didn't last long or allow subs to run at high speeds, and to be recharged, the subs had to surface.
Quebec is a closed-cycle submarine. That is, it uses the same type of engine both on the surface and underwater, which is not an easy thing to do because the engine on the surface needs air. When it's running underwater, you have to have some replacement for the oxygen.
The
job of the designers was to figure out how to provide oxygen so the diesel engine could operate underwater.
If the technology could be perfected, fleets of high-speed submarines could roam the shoreline or venture into the open ocean, outrunning anti-submarine forces and posing a major threat to Western navies.
Their hope was that they had developed a kind of completely new propulsion system that would give their Navy a tremendous advantage over every other Navy in the world.
The first serious advances on closed-cycle engines were made in Nazi Germany, but like so many other Nazi secret weapons, came too late to help the Germans win the war. For the Soviets, the timing was just right.
In reparation, we received the German fleet. Germany had always been at the forefront of submarine design, and our specialists went there to secure this technology.
The Soviets also rounded up many of Germany's top designers and went on to create a diesel engine that was a significant advance on the original German design. The engine ran underwater on tanks of liquid oxygen. The Quebecs travelled submerged at up to 15 knots, allowing them to cover nearly 60 miles at top speed. At a speed of just 3 knots, they could stay underwater for more than 4 days. For the Soviet military, it was a major coup. Nothing comparable existed in the West. Pure oxygen, however, was highly flammable and worse. Fire and explosion could release toxic gases. Despite this, the Soviets pushed ahead undeterred, building 30 submarines in all, and filling them with 1,000 men, determined to gain a technological edge over the West, whatever the cost.
They were willing to push this thing through before they had any real evidence that it worked terribly well. They would accept something at a much cruder level when it might be much more dangerous to use because that wouldn't bother them very much. Stalin tended to be very contemptuous of individuals, so he believed that it didn't really matter who you killed, you could always find a replacement.
But Radi Shmakov defends the Quebecs.
Our fleet needed these subs. It's true they had mishaps, but it was expected that the problems would be worked out.
But was the Quebec worth the risk to sailors' lives?
What's amazing about a Quebec is they're willing to kill themselves for fairly trivial advantage. When it's all over, it's not really that devastating a weapon. The advantage of it is that if you can run at high speed underwater, really high speed, say about 20 knots, then it's very difficult for a conventional anti-submarine craft to catch you. So in fact, underwater Quebec is about 12 or 14 knots, which is not that impressive.
In the rush to catch up with the West, the Soviets introduced the Quebecs prematurely, hoping they could perform as expected and operate safely. The sailors of Quebec submarine M256 would pay heavily for this mistake. At a restricted submarine base near St. Petersburg lie the rusting remains of a Quebec submarine, an exact replica of the M256 that went down in September 1957 with 42 sailors. Andrei Kochetkov and Arkady Masenko were on board that day and were lucky to make it out alive.
Here's Ivan Sidorenko, our doctor. Sometimes people meet and are simply drawn to each other. That's us. This is Bryliantov.
He was a smart, interesting person. Interesting from the inside. He wasn't bad from the outside either.
Most of the boys had a sense of pride in our homeland. The catastrophe that occurred on M256 at the very beginning of my career, only 6 months after I finished school, really shook me. What shook me was the death of the people aboard. Nice, young, well-educated, focused people who had plans for their lives.
On September the 26th, 1957, M256, along with its 42-man crew, set out on a task force operation in the Finnish Gulf. When it arrived at its assigned position, it descended to about 100 feet. Kochetkov was in the control room.
I was working here, bent over the map, when I heard someone yell, "Blow the ballast!" I looked over in this direction. Black steam was coming out of this pipe.
A fire had broken out. Fed by the oxygen carried on board, it quickly got out of control and moved rapidly through the sub. Sailors grabbed their masks as toxic fumes seeped through the poorly installed hermetic seals. Soon, flooding began. the fire couldn't be contained. They would have to evacuate.
All of the dead sailors were found behind the barrier to the central entrance here. The gas poisoned them almost instantly.
The electricity failed and the lights went out, plunging the sub into darkness.
Toxicity was so high, the crew were ordered onto the deck.
Amidst the chaos, M256 managed to surface. A coded distress call was sent out to a command station along the coastline. Gale force winds and a storm tossed the sub dangerously in the heavy seas. Those who'd survived the poison gas and fire clambered onto the deck and waited to be rescued.
We went out onto the deck. The waves started crashing over us and it was calm. When the waves receded, we could breathe.
The crew held on as best it could. Rescue ships arrived and a line was thrown.
Because of the storm and the rocking of the boat, the steel cable suddenly snapped.
Kirill Krasnopolsky was on board of one of those rescue ships.
We saw one of the sailors get washed off. The situation was getting worse.
We signaled that we were expecting an explosion and requested immediate evacuation of the crew.
But aware of the Quebec's reputation, the rescue ships, instead of approaching to evacuate the stricken sub, pulled back. The submarine started to sink.
I looked back, and in an instant the stern pitched into the water. The bow went up in the air, and the water was up to the cabin window. The only thing left to do was swim. The crew fought its way out as best they could.
Waves and wind blew the lifebuoys away from the quickly tiring survivors. After each wave, there were fewer and fewer on the surface.
In that kind of storm, it's almost impossible to do anything. In the Baltics, the water temperature is very low. You can only endure such temperatures for 20 to 25 minutes. Then you lose consciousness. Then your life.
7 men were saved, 35 perished. After the sinking and raising of M256, a commission of inquiry was set up. Classified top secret, mere mention of the accident could lead to imprisonment. To this day, the report remains classified. But those who testified have spoken out about the sub's flawed construction, calling it the Iron Coffin. In its final report, the commission laid the blame on the dead, who weren't there to defend themselves, and on the rescue teams. Even today, the survivors hide their indignation. Mistakes are only hinted at off-camera. The old Soviet tendency towards secrecy is still ingrained, and the men are reluctant to criticize a system to which they have devoted their lives.
All new kinds of innovations are almost always accompanied by negative consequences. The same happened here, but you understand, you are unintentionally luring me into a discussion of the political side of the question.
The commander of M256 could have allowed the sub to wash up on a nearby sandbar and save his crew, although it would have damaged the sub and landed the Soviet commander in prison. Instead, he dropped anchor, going down with his crew and sub. For more than 40 years, the Soviet government concealed the truth of what happened in the Finnish Gulf.
My father was a doctor.
Sergei Sidorenko was just 2 years old when his father died on the M256.
Не хватало заботы о людях.
There wasn't enough consideration for the people involved. There was more thought about the technology than about the people.
Maria Brilyantova's husband, Oleg, was one of the 35 who perished.
He understood it was an experiment and that it was being tested. He didn't want to serve on it. He had seen too much. He just didn't want to.
Even today, her bitterness is barely concealed.
I heard about it from the wife of a fellow sailor. She called and told me to contact some of her acquaintances to find out the details. They told me it was a catastrophe. No one called from headquarters.
For years, Sergei Sidorenko tried in vain to learn what happened.
When I became a student, I was interested very much about my father, my history, and I went to Admiralty and discussed this question with very important person from Admiralty. But nobody answered me.
The Soviet government never released the truth. To relatives, they said it was unnecessary to upset the public with bad news. The task of preserving the crew's memory was left to the survivors and the relatives. Only when the Soviet Union fell did the truth finally emerge. In 1992, reports started to appear in the press, and information trickled out from official sources. That same year, a plaque honoring the 35 men was unveiled at St. Nicholas Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Official admission and recognition finally came in 1997, when President Boris Yeltsin proposed that those who died be decorated for giving their lives to their homeland. Despite the passage of time, relatives and survivors still gather to pay their respects and remember.
Well, my friends, more than 43 years ago, the M256 went down in the Gulf of Finland. Our friends and husbands died. We became orphans and widows. Let's remember our military comrades who gave their lives to the strengthening of our fleet. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
But the men of submarine M256 would not be alone. These two retired men live in the Russian city of Nizhny Novgorod, some 200 miles east of Moscow. They're watching on the local evening news a report about a once secret factory in the once secret city where they used to work. The local reporter calls what was built here the Soviet Union's greatest secret. In the 1960s, these men played key roles in testing this top secret weapon, the Ekranoplan. This is the KM Ekranoplan. KM meaning prototype, and Ekranoplan meaning a never-before-seen hybrid of a ship and a plane. The KM was the largest and most incredible Ekranoplan of them all.
A year after that,
Stephen Hooker, a former US intelligence analyst and Ekranoplan expert, stumbled across this blurry spy photo of the stub-winged craft in 1967. At a loss for words to describe it, he and his colleagues dubbed it the Caspian Sea Monster. The film we see here was never seen publicly until the collapse of the Soviet Union.
When I see an image like this, I'm just awestruck, because here you truly see a ship that has been taught to fly. This is an American football field. If you put the goalposts here and the stadium around it, the horizontal stabilizer would be up in the bleachers.
The KM was a massive, low-flying craft that flew barely 60 feet over the water. Nikita Khrushchev hoped it would give the Soviet Union a decisive military advantage over the West. He envisaged a fleet of Ekranoplans that would fly below radar detection at jet-like speeds, carrying hundreds of troops and their equipment, or a battery of intermediate-range missiles, right up to enemy shores. The Ekranoplan was the brainchild of Rostislav Alexeyev, a brilliant and visionary hydrofoil designer who'd long dreamed of boats that flew. Alexeyev dazzled Khrushchev with the military potential of his ideas and was given a green light to build one of the largest flying machines the world had ever seen. When Khrushchev came to power in 1953, Stalin's notoriously repressive regime gave way to a more relaxed and open leadership. A period of relative freedom for new thinking and new ideas was ushered in.
Stalin believed that the way you ran the country was to scare the living daylights out of everybody. Khrushchev believed that the terror had basically knocked the spirit out of the country, so that unless it was relaxed, nothing could be done.
Khrushchev was a simple man who enjoyed simple pleasures. His more conservative Politburo colleagues would later accuse him of dragging them into adventures that led nowhere. But behind the Kremlin walls, Khrushchev was deadly serious.
Khrushchev took power at a particular difficult moment. That was when the U.S. had a rather huge nuclear monopoly. Therefore, he had a sense of desperation about finding ways to compensate for their military inadequacies.
At the United Nations, Khrushchev once bragged that Russia had ships that could jump over bridges. Nobody knew what he meant. Khrushchev wasn't the only one talking in code. The mere mention of the word Ekranoplan was a jailable offense.
We were surprised to hear that everyone was talking about some kind of steamboat.
Tatiana is the daughter of the renowned Ekranoplan designer, and she worked alongside her father as his assistant.
I found out that steamboat was the Ekranoplan. There was a scandal in the ministry because father used to say it during secret conferences. They got very angry with him for speaking disrespectfully.
Annoying his superiors was not uncommon for Alexeyev. With his cocky demeanor and good looks, he often clashed with his bosses. But Alexeyev was determined to realize his dreams. He was a free, some might say stubborn thinker in a closed society. Stalin had imprisoned his father for 3 years because of his aristocratic origins. While at best indifferent to communist ideology, Alexeyev was a true Russian patriot who wanted to do good for his country. Alexeyev had a passion for sports, motorcycling, skiing, but most of all he loved boats and speed. The course of his life was set when he built his first boat by hand at the age of 22. From then on, he resolved to take boats faster and faster, so fast they flew. Alexeyev set up his design bureau in Nizhny Novgorod. During the Soviet period, it was known as Gorky, an important military-industrial center, completely off-limits to foreigners and Russians without special passes. Alexeyev was a pioneer in the development of hydrofoils, and despite having to work through the cumbersome Soviet bureaucracy, he became one of the world's leading designers. But by the 1950s, he had developed another idea, the Ekranoplan. Alexander Moskalik was, from the earliest days, Alexeyev's chief scientist.
It It's no coincidence that in the course of his life, Alexeyev made two inventions. The first was a ship with wings placed underwater. The second was with wings above the water. He made a logical switch from movement through the water to movement through the air.
Alexeyev had the funding to build small ekranoplan models on his own. But to properly test his ideas, he would need a huge injection of funds. Like all Soviet design bureaus, Alexeyev had to continually fight for resources from a rigidly centralized planned economy that favored military over civilian projects.
Their system favored military over civilian, totally. It wasn't guns or butter, it was guns give you butter. It was a military-led society. Stalin produced such a society.
Alexeyev had never been a military type, but to get the funding he needed, he knew he would have to show the ekranoplan had military applications. In the aftermath of Stalin's regime of terror, he would find a receptive ear in the heart of the Kremlin. Khrushchev's consolidation of power during the 1950s would provide the opportunity Alexeyev was looking for. Khrushchev was an innovator who planned to challenge the West with bold and fearsome projects. Like the Sputnik launch in 1957, they were intended to show off Soviet technological superiority.
He was, if you like, a technology freak. He believed that deterrence could work, and that made him really like examples of high technology that would impress the West. Not only do spectacular projects pay off big, but you don't have to have a lot of them.
Alexeyev and other designers were given direct access to Khrushchev to pitch their ideas and lobby for money. If, like the famed Soviet aircraft maker Andrei Topolov, Alexeyev could convince Khrushchev that one throw of the dice could change the East-West balance, their financial tap would open. In 1960, Alexeyev made a personal appeal to Khrushchev at a party meeting. Alexander Moskalik was there.
He went up to Alexeyev and shook his hand and thanked him for coming. This is how their relationship began.
Alexeyev proposed what would be a technological marvel, a fleet of enormous flying ships that would exploit some of the most revolutionary aerodynamic theories. Khrushchev loved it.
Of all the people I've met in government, I have never seen anyone's eyes light up more than Khrushchev's when talking about technology.
Alexeyev and Khrushchev were kindred spirits, each willing to take big risks for their ideas. Alexeyev was the artist, and Khrushchev became his patron.
It was amazing how two people could understand each other right away. Khrushchev was extremely excited, and he drew up a personal contract for Alexeyev.
For the next 6 years, Alexeyev worked feverishly to perfect his theories and construct the first large-scale ekranoplan, the KM. He knew that because of water resistance, boats and hydrofoils could only move so fast. To go faster, his boats would have to leave the water completely. To this end, Alexeyev developed a thorough understanding of an aerodynamic phenomenon known as ground effect, a sensation of riding on a cushion of air, long noticed by pilots when landing. Alexeyev turned what pilots had long considered simply an annoyance into a technology that could revolutionize the performance of ships. But there was one problem. How would they get it out of the water? Alexeyev's solution was to put massive engines at the front of the fuselage. Their powerful exhausts would be blown under the wings, creating a temporary hovercraft. As speed increased, the entire ship would lift out of the water, and ground effect would take over. After 6 years of costly development, the KM was rolled out of its hangar in Gorky and sent down the river Volga to its testing site on the Caspian Sea. On October the 11th, 1966, it made its first flight. Dmitry Garbuzov and Vitaly Peshinov were the pilot and co-pilot. Alexeyev sat between them, controlling the engines. The 8 front engines roared to life, propelling the KM forward and out of the water. At 540 tons, it was 150 tons heavier than the future Boeing 747 and larger than a B-52. The tail was 5 stories high. It was by far the biggest and heaviest creation ever to take off. For Dmitry Garbuzov, the test pilot, it was a memorable day.
You noticed how the seagulls flapped to get out of your way. The machine flew frighteningly low. Everyone was amazed by how such a cumbersome contraption could fly.
The first flight was a resounding success, and hopes ran high for the KM's military applications. Later tests proved it could fly at more than 400 miles an hour. There were no press announcements of the KM's maiden flight, or any other Ekranoplan flight. Everything about it was hidden behind an impenetrable veil of secrecy. But what Alexeyev and his team never knew was that they were being observed by American intelligence. In the late 1950s, the U-2 spy plane provided the United States with valuable information about the Soviet Union. When U-2 pilot Gary Powers was shot down and captured in 1960, the spy flights came to an immediate halt. But with the launch of the top-secret Corona reconnaissance satellite, vast expanses of the Soviet Union could be photographed from the safe vantage of space. One day in 1966, Stephen Hooker and his team of Corona photo analysts, by chance, noticed a strange-looking craft at an old Second World War submarine plant on the western shore of the Caspian Sea. A craft that was too big to be hidden.
They had no choice with something this size but to hope that they could put it somewhere where they wouldn't expect us to be wasting our film.
Unaware of what they were looking at, they called it the Caspian Sea Monster.
The first question that came up was, is it a complete aircraft? It looks, after all, like the wings are missing. So we put wings on it, and when we did that, it turned out not to be a very good performing airplane. Having many meetings.
But why build an aircraft that couldn't fly? Through models and extensive tests, Hooker and his colleagues deduced it was a ground effect aircraft. The US government kept the secret until the end of the Cold War. Back in Russia, Alexeyev succeeded in mastering ground effect. Ekranoplans could fly more efficiently than high-flying planes, and this foreshadowed the development of even larger and more threatening craft.
It didn't escape their notice that this scales to larger and larger sizes. Suppose you built a large vessel to deploy troops. Suppose you built something twice the size of KM and now carried 500-600 troops in it, and with that their full complement of armor and so forth, perhaps 1,000, 1,500 tons.
But what Alexeyev and American intelligence experts did not know was that by its first flight in 1966, the KM and Alexeyev's grand ambitions were already doomed. In 1964, 2 years before the first flight of the KM Ekranoplan, Rostislav Alexeyev's benefactor, Nikita Khrushchev, was deposed from power by Leonid Brezhnev. The political climate changed dramatically, and the winds quickly turned against Alexeyev. Risk-taking, like putting missiles in Cuba, was out. Conservative orthodoxy and gradualism were now the order of the day.
Brezhnev came along, and he and Kosygin accused Khrushchev of harebrained scheming, of adventurism, taking too big a risk. We've got to settle back, cross the board, build real military power that transcends the capitalist camp's power.
Khrushchev's unorthodox experiments, like the Ekranoplan, were out of favor.
We had a chance to show Brezhnev our work. When we began to show our film footage, he sat, fell asleep, then asked, "When's lunch?"
Alexeyev, the maverick, had lost his direct access to the top. Brezhnev returned control of the Ekranoplan project to a once bypassed and now hostile ministry eager for revenge. In 1968, when the testing of the KM was at its most intense, Alexeyev was summoned to Moscow and removed as head of his own design bureau. His daughter, Tatiana, recalls the day he returned home.
I asked what was wrong, and he said he'd just come from the ministry where they'd been slinging mud at him. He went to work in the morning and found a new director sitting at his desk. That's how he was removed. It was a purely political move.
Alexeyev had been demoted to his own bureau's chief designer, and while the Ekranoplan project continued, funding was slowly reduced to a trickle. Alexeyev's demotion continued inexorably until he was completely pushed aside. While continuing to work, his will to live was slowly sapped away. He died in 1980.
During his last 4 years, he finally broke down. He was already growing old and simply didn't have the strength. How many times can you begin over again from zero? He simply couldn't endure it physically.
For Alexeyev, his work had been unfulfilled.
He apparently felt that he was leaving us, and he said very quietly, "I want to say that I have not been understood. I didn't achieve what I wanted."
Alexeyev spent years toiling for the Soviet military, all the while dreaming of a time when the Ekranoplan would serve the civilian world, carrying passengers and cargo. He'd also dreamed of ships even larger than the KM. But with his influence cut off, and with Brezhnev in power, the Soviet military opted for two smaller designs. The first was the Olyonuk, a rapid deployment troop carrier. Because it was amphibious, it could land directly on enemy shores, with little regard to the condition of the sea, tide, underwater obstacles or mines. The second was the Loon, which traveled at 300 miles an hour. It was designed to carry anti-ship missiles that could attack American carrier task forces. Only one KM was ever built, and that too died in 1980. On December the 15th, it was taken out for a test flight. The years of neglect, whittled funds, and ministry obstruction had taken its toll. In the pilot seat sat an inexperienced pilot who crashed the KM, killing it for good. A commission of inquiry was established, but its conclusions were never published.
I suspect that the Ministry of Shipbuilding heaved a sigh of relief, glad they wouldn't have to finance it further.
Like the Quebec-class submarines, the Ekranoplan was an audacious concept that fell foul of a system fatally incapable of realizing its full military potential.
The Russians are a wonderful people, and they are wonderful designers and wonderful theoreticians. They had difficulty with this strong central government. While they made magnificent designs and magnificent theory, it was difficult for them to put these into practice.
But Alexeyev has not been forgotten, and today is remembered in statues and monuments all over Nizhny Novgorod. Although the city's old town has kept its charm, crime is on the rise, and the old market babushkas must pay bribes and raise their prices beyond the local wages. The surrounding landscape is littered with the relics of a military-industrial sector on life support, struggling to make the transition from communism to capitalism.
The economy of the Soviet Union was built not for peace. It was built only for war. And when this economy, this totally militarized economy, and still very totally militarized, was open to the outside forces of the world market, well, it just simply began collapsing.
Inside the Ekranoplan factory, now just another communist dinosaur, is a rusting, modified Loon Ekranoplan for sale. There are no takers. The management still clings to the hope that Russia will again be a military superpower and huge subsidies will flow their way. Meanwhile, the workers and the old pensioners who gave their lives to the Soviet military live in poverty. Vitaly Peshinov was on the first and many other flights of the KM. As a test pilot, he risked his life often and accepted harsh living conditions as part of Alexeyev's team.
I tell you, I regret my whole life. To think about it brings me to the point of tears. We worked and nothing came of it. In our old age, we are discarded and forgotten. I'll say it right out, forgotten. Life has passed us by, my boys. All of this technology was top secret. We lived in secrecy. We lived in the woods, so no one would see us. We saw nothing of life. Life passed me by. I didn't even make any money.
Today he lives on a pension of about £22 a month and can barely afford the medicines he needs to stay alive.
We're absolutely destitute. I am no longer ashamed to say so.
Men like Vitaly Peshinov were the unwitting victims of a Soviet military ready to sacrifice its own on the altar of military might. The Ekranoplan and the Quebec submarine were audacious but costly secret weapons programs that were, more than anything else, a reflection of the Soviet Union's paranoia over Western military superiority. Today the Russian people are paying a steep price for their once militarized society, a price they will continue to pay for many years to come.
That foray into the Cold War brings our programmes to a close until our new day begins at 8 a.m. Amongst the highlights of the coming evening, a major exploration of volcanoes, which gets underway at 9 p.m. For now, though, on behalf of the History Channel team, it just remains for me, David Allen, to wish you a very good night and good morning.
And went on to create a diesel engine that was a significant advance on the original German design. The engine ran underwater on tanks of liquid oxygen. The Quebecs travelled submerged at up to 15 knots, allowing them to cover nearly 60 miles at top speed. At a speed of just 3 knots, they could stay underwater for more than 4 days. For the Soviet military, it was a major coup. Nothing comparable existed in the West. Pure oxygen, however, was highly flammable and worse. Fire and explosion could release toxic gases. Despite this, the Soviets pushed ahead undeterred, building 30 submarines in all, and filling them with 1,000 men, determined to gain a technological edge over the West, whatever the cost.
They were willing to push this thing through before they had any real evidence that it worked terribly well. They would accept something at a much cruder level when it might be much more dangerous to use because that wouldn't bother them very much. Stalin tended to be very contemptuous of
On a cold December day, mourners filed past a solemn monument at a cemetery near St. Petersburg. They have come to remember those lost in an almost forgotten Cold War tragedy, the sinking of submarine M256.
We were only together 3.5 years, and we rarely saw each other. He was always at sea.
In September 1957, 35 men died when fire and toxic gas poured into their submarine in violent seas.
I wanted my children to know about grandfather.
Relatives and friends still feel the loss. But comrades and fellow survivors recall with pride their service to the Soviet cause at the height of the Cold War.
We had an extraordinary sense of responsibility and were proud to serve on such an unusual submarine.
M256 was a Quebec-class submarine, the NATO designation for a diesel sub of revolutionary design and menacing capabilities with no real counterpart in the West. Initiated under Stalin and built in the 50s, it was a top-secret project. If this revolutionary technology could be developed and built to its full potential, Stalin's navy would have a powerful submarine that could stay submerged for record periods of time and travel at vastly improved speeds. But the potential technological advance exacted a high price: the lives of the crews who manned it. The Quebecs were sea-borne powder kegs, introduced before they were safe, and the submariners nicknamed them matchsticks. Before the advent of the Quebecs, and later nuclear submarines, diesel subs relied on batteries to run underwater. Their diesel engines required oxygen and worked only on the surface. But batteries didn't last long or allow subs to run at high speeds. And to be recharged, the subs had to surface.
Quebec is a closed-cycle submarine. That is, it uses the...
Today, it's a peaceful scene. But not so long ago, it was where the Soviet Union paraded its military might. At the height of the Cold War, Stalin, Khrushchev and Brezhnev all denounced the imperialist USA and boasted of the superiority of the Soviet military and its weapons. But with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the inner workings of the military's industrial system were revealed, and their once secret military programs came to light. Behind the fearsome facade lay the reality: a Soviet military that was ready to sacrifice lives, and in its rush to surpass the West, a military that failed to capitalize on weapons programs of great promise.
Same type of engine both on the surface and underwater, which is not an easy thing to do because the engine on the surface needs air. When it's running underwater, you have to have some replacement for the oxygen.
The job of the designers was to figure out how to provide oxygen so the diesel engine could operate underwater.
If the technology could be perfected, fleets of high-speed submarines could roam the shoreline or venture into the open ocean, outrunning anti-submarine forces and posing a major threat to Western navies.
Their hope was that they had developed a kind of completely new propulsion system that would give their navy a tremendous advantage over every other navy in the world.
The first serious advances on closed-cycle engines were made in Nazi Germany, but like so many other Nazi secret weapons, came too late to help the Germans win the war. For the Soviets, the timing was just right.
In reparation, we received the German fleet. Germany had always been at the forefront of submarine design, and our specialists went there to secure this technology.
The Soviets also rounded up many of Germany's top designers.